First of all, welcome to last of today's sessions in this track before the armchair discussion. And this session covers You Can't Organize Your Way to a Future, Principles Matter. Now, I've got three truly wonderful speakers here today. We have this Slack channel where all the speakers get together and they talk about what they're going to talk about. And this group, by far, has been the one that has worried me the most. I mean, we've gone everywhere from Cardi B to anarchy, from the president of Antifa to Christian dads that vape. I mean, I have no idea what's going to happen. I have no idea where we're going. I mean, this is just a blast. Wonderful speakers. We've got an order. Today is order in that question about principles matter. Our order is Farrah, Kat and Ben, and what I'm going to do is ask them each to introduce themselves, and then we'll get into the actual speaking. So starting with Farrah. Hello, Farrah.
Hi, everybody. My name is Farrah. I live in Portland, Oregon, one of the Antifa jurisdictions, and I'm very excited to be here with everybody today.
The Republic of Antifa. Apparently you're president as well. Is that correct?
I've been nominated.
But we're not allowed to say that. Right. Super. So and next up is Kat.
Hello, I'm Kat Swetel. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. There's a very loud rooster outside, so that could happen. And I work at Berica, which is the chaos engineering continuous verification company. I think that's it.
Kat, absolute pleasure. Swetel, do you know, I've known you for so long, I've been getting that wrong. That just shows you just how situationally unaware I truly am. And last, and certainly not least, is Ben.
Hello, everyone. My name is Ben Mosior. I'm at Hired Thought on Twitter, and I run learnwardleymapping.com. So it's really nice to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's wonderful to have you all here. So Farrah, to begin with, I'm going to throw the ball over to you. Screen is all yours. I'm going to go on mute. And for everybody else, if you have questions, we've got this Q&A thing. Please pop your questions in there, and I can use those when we get into the discussion, because it's 15 minutes of speaking, 15 minutes of discussion, 15 minutes speaking. And well, you get the theme. We just repeat it 3 times. All right, Farrah, over to you.
Thanks, Simon. Hi, everybody. So we're going to talk about today, principles matter. You cannot organize your way to a future. And I know I just introduced myself, but a little bit more. My name is Farrah. I mean, I'm the Alliance and Ecosystem Director at Stackery. I somehow became an AWS serverless hero. And I'm also extremely new to this. And so I am grateful for I'm grateful that Wardley maps are always wrong, so I don't have to worry about, coming up here and speaking to everyone today. So how did my mapping journey begin? Well, mapping caught my attention because Simon was talking about how he was using it to understand how to market and how serverless was going to beat out Kubernetes. I then had the opportunity to meet Simon at Serverless Conf in 2018, where he was keynoting. And then after his keynote, I had so many questions, and I found him outside smoking his vape, and I decided to join him. And then, questions led to more questions, and I really just had this, desire, to want to learn more. So fun fact, I did not start learning to, or start trying to learn how to map until 2019, when I was at, DevOps Days, Meet Serverless Days, Meets Map Camp in Atlanta. And I watched one of Kat's talks, and I'm pretty sure she was talking about me because she had said, and this is how, when she starts talking about talking to people about mapping, that they are always saying that they are really excited to, do their first map. And then she's like, well, then do it. And I remember walking away just thinking, like, why hadn't I done it? And so maybe I should. Another fun fact is when I decided that I was going to start learning how to Wardley map, I actually became a patron of Ben's, who was extremely helpful. And just the way his learnings were, the way he taught how to map really helped me. And so it's a complete honor for me to be, standing, or I guess, virtually with them today, speaking to everybody. Okay, so here, I'm going out to get started, want to understand mapping, but I wasn't trying to understand mapping to win a market. I wasn't really trying to do it for personal gain. What I was trying to do is to understand how to better affect the system that I was playing within, and understand, the reasons why things were happening the way that they were. I had many, many, many questions as I started to, understand more about topographical intelligence. This is made to exploit the landscape. I started thinking immediately, do we think about the long-term effects of exploiting this landscape? I also wondered the ability for, the people that are making the decisions to actually be able to see ways to exploit that system. And then I wondered if maybe, somebody like me that was an operator within that system might be better suited to, find those opportunities. So I'm starting to learn more about the strategy cycle, more about the game, the why of purpose, the why of movement. Learning that this strategy cycle is iterative, it's not linear, it's constantly evolving, and acting is essential to learning. And if this is, this is iterative, how do I make sure that, this game is something that I want to continue to play, or that, I have my why of purpose and the why of movement? How do I know that I'm making those decisions? And how do I make sure that this game doesn't start to play me, or that I don't end up becoming part of this game? Moving on to user needs. We see a lot of things, where I guess in the mapping, we see a lot of like tools, and, you need better UX, and you need CRM, and there's all these things about systems, but I didn't see anything about people. And I think, people buy from people, and, today, in today's world of transparency and fast flowing information, I think people do business with people that they know, people that they trust. And I wondered if this is something that we should be, that we should add to the map. And then if we did, how would we do that? Where would we put that? So more about the strategy cycle and climactic patterns, and, and understanding that, everything is going to be evolving, and that competition is always going to force change. And if this is iterative, how am I continuously assessing my why of purpose, my why of movement? Does that matter here? How can I affect parts of the cycle that, feel off to me? How do I make sure, again, like, how do I make sure that this game does not start playing me? The movement within a system, we learn about the business is not static, it's living, it's made up of people, it's made up of activities and capital. So I start to think, how do we think about the future impacts of the change that we are affecting? Do we think about how does it affect the people? How does it affect the activities that they're a part of? And I'm wondering if, when we're making these decisions, are they all transactional based, or is there any relation-based thinking here? Moving on to design for constant evolution, these iterative cycles again and again. If this is a game that we're consistently playing, using technology to up-level and to accelerate our learnings, how do I make sure that this machine doesn't start to work against us? How do I know that this is the game that I want to continue to play? If my decisions are all about the value chain and the capital gain, and as this evolves, how do I know that it's still working for everyone? And what data am I using to derive this knowledge? How can I affect social capital, but in a way that won't be taken over and consumed, by this value chain? Again, I have more and more and more questions. We are in a world of rapid innovation cycles. Technology is changing and advancing every single day. I begin to wonder, this rapid cycle of change, are the pioneers getting tired? Are the settlers getting tired of the town planners capitalizing off their work? Do they want to be a town planner? What does it take to be one? Do the town planners always leverage others' work? How does that begin to affect them, later in life? Is there any chance that they maybe want to partner and accelerate growth together? Innovate, leverage, accelerate, again and again and again. We're capitalizing off one another. How do we ask ourselves what our intentions are, and how are we remaining grounded when making these, when we're making these decisions? What are the consequences that all this has on everyone? This constant one-upping. We're developing things, but what are the unintended consequences? I think about the Facebook like button. They create this, to bring like joy and happiness, and now it's being used against us, in advertising. And how are we challenging our bias and assumptions, and how do we ensure that we have the right people to be able to do so? So I'm looking to figure out, like, how do I find an anchor with all this? And I come across a blog that was written by Stephen Covey, and it talks about a moral compassing, and a compass is better than a map. Maps give us context, they give us visual representation, but they are constantly evolving and they're constantly wrong. So since maps change, compass bearings are constant. He goes on to talk about principles are like a compass. A compass has a true north that is objective and external, that reflects natural laws or principles, as opposed to values, which are subjective and internal. And our true north is our internal compass that guides us through life. So some examples of values, our values are beliefs, their attitudes, opinions that people hold, regarding specific issues. Their standards of behavior about what is important in life, but they are subjective and they change over time. So an example would be, one of my core values is patience. Patience is a virtue. But if I'm waiting for a date to show up and they show up 2 hours late, I certainly wouldn't value patience in that instance. So it's situation dependent, and this changes over time. Principles are fundamental truths that are permanent, they're unchanging, and they're universal in nature. They include things like integrity, dignity, honesty, quality, service. And I think it'd be, silly to think that anybody would argue against these. Stephen Covey goes on to describe principles as a natural law like gravity. So if you drop something, gravity controls. So if I don't tell you the truth, you won't trust me, and that's natural law. Excuse me. How do, when we react to these principles, and they impact us in every aspect of our lives. For example, the principle of trust could impact us on, 4 levels. That's, my trustworthiness. Do people trust me? Do the people trust me to empower others? Do people trust me to gain alignment? If you have a compass with you, you know where you're going, you know the rough direction, what that is, and that's what maps help us. That's what they give us. That's what they give us. They give us that visual context. But a compass will help us to be able to withstand far more types of weather than, if we just had a map. And I will leave you with the story about Dom Vasco da Gama, who was a Portuguese navigator. And in 1497, in the Age of Discovery, and he was part of one of the explorers from Spain, when all hope was lost, he had come across a compass before going on this actual trip. And without that compass, without that guide to keep him on the right path, he would have been lost in the abyss of the Mediterranean, and he would have found India. A good name is better than great riches. I stand true to that. So again, I would say that to move forward, I think principles matter. Maps are good for visual context, but visual principles will give us that anchor to help guide us through. Thank you.
Wow, wonderful. So principles matter. I love that distinction between the values as in things we believe, and principles and things of what we do and the ways in which we operate. So I often, when I'm doing the culture mapping, separate out those two. And I have what I call the doctrine, i.e. my set of universally useful principles. Here's a bunch of things we all should do. Things like focusing on user needs. And of course, they're evolving to some extent. They're being extended. So in the past, it was focusing on user needs. But now we've gone beyond that with mapping. People are now concentrating on user-centric design. So they're actually building the maps. We have this with government agencies, building the maps with people like farmers, because, hey, rather than me just telling you what your needs are, I'm going to sit down and work with you. Fascinating space. And you also talked about the whole unintended consequences. I love the compass is better than map. All fabulous stuff. So before I go and have a look at the audience to see if they've got questions, Ben, Kat, do you have any questions to ask?
I do. I have one of the things that jumped out to me as you were talking was, thinking about needing a true north as like an ought, like something everyone should do just because, versus thinking of needing a true north because sometimes we can't actually see. Sometimes we can't actually see the landscape that's in play. So I was wondering if you had any thoughts on like what happens in real life when we can't see what's at play, and how principles, how doctrine can help us navigate that.
Yeah, that's actually I think a really good point. And I think that's actually kind of one of the things that kind of like drew me, is because I feel that as you're advancing in your career, you have no idea what you're up against, and as you change companies, you have no idea what you're up against. But I will say that since starting mine and getting into tech, I held one thing true, is that I was going to be this positive person that showed up every single day, and this person that cared more about amplifying others' work and making sure that other people had what they need, instead of focusing on myself. And that was a distinct switch that I'd made when getting to tech, and it's been my career has grown in ways that I never, ever thought were possible. And I do think without that true north kind of guiding me along the way, because I've been told many times that I wasn't doing it right, and that I was getting stepped on or walked on. And I didn't think I was, I just think that I was playing a different game than they were.
Kat, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Farrah, I'm wondering if your true north has stayed very consistent throughout your life, or if it has evolved or shifted or changed in any way.
No, mine definitely has changed. And I actually I've been thinking about like what happened with that. And I think there's a lot of things that I think that you can say that you believe or that you value to be true, or ways that you think about how communities or society, but then when you actually take time to actually learn more about it, you realize, or maybe you're acting on it, you realize that this is definitely not who I want to be. I've made a complete switch. I was brought up very, Christian, very much, my parents were telling me what was to be true. I still, to this day, get emails from my stepdad and my mom breaking down the election and why I should vote the way and how I should vote and how I should think. So I do think, yeah, it definitely has changed for me. And I would say that was probably right about the time I got into tech and did make that distinct, that I wanted to be somebody different, and I knew that the only person that could change that was me.
I'm really curious about that transition point where, how do you notice that suddenly either you're changing or that you need to change?
When you don't like what's happening around you, and like relationships aren't going the way that you think they should go, or they're the conversations are tough. How do I think it's when I got into a bigger, when I got into a bigger city and different, more people that didn't look like me. I wasn't able to have these views and, predisposed ideas about who they were and how they were going to behave. And I think that's actually, one of the things that I really loved about traveling, because I hadn't done that, prior to working in tech, traveling internationally. And, I had all the, ideas about like what it was going to be like instead of, and I think, getting out of that, small, town where, things just want to, where people seem that they want to be stagnant. Yeah. Hope that answers.
So I've got a question here from the audience. I'm going to modify it slightly because the question from Jan says, can you please give more concrete examples of permanent, unchanging and universal nature of quality? Well, when we talk about principles, I talk about universally useful principles, as in they seem to apply to everyone. But of course, they're transient. Even things like focusing on user needs eventually becomes, cooperative design with people. So can you give me some examples of those principles which you think are universally useful?
So the ones that I think are integrity, trustworthy, kind. Those are the ones that stay. Those are the ones that I keep close to me because that's the kind of person that's the kind of person that I want to be.
So then I'm going to throw that back at you.
Okay.
And say, aren't those beliefs? And I'll give you my case example, because if I map out political systems, from a point of view of government, if I want to retain power, there's two ways I can go. One is to do good and educate people. The other is just to manipulate perception and behavior. And the problem with today's society, it is now so cheap to manipulate perception and behavior, then why as a government would you bother to do good and try to educate people? So if you're
But why wouldn't you?
Because it's cheaper just to manipulate people and perception, unless in your culture is heavily ingrained the belief of things like integrity. And I'm going to say, this is what I'm going to throw at you, I think it's true maybe more Eastern and Confucian cultures where that integrity seems to be critical. And it's less so in the West. And my case examples would be the UK and the US. What do you think?
I guess that my question is that if we're always operating with money in mind, how do we as a society and we as get better? Is that something that we should be focused on? Should it always be about the capital gains? And I don't think so.
Ben, Kat, do you want to jump in?
Oh, I want to jump in.
Oh, please, and please, tear away.
Yeah, Farrah and I have discussed this at length many, many times. So, we still cheaper, right? It's cheaper. It's much cheaper to persuade people in these really nefarious ways, right? Rather than doing good, but convincing them that something that's not actually good for them is good for them. That's very cheap. I find it incredible that we can still be oriented towards that mindset of scarcity, right? In a time when everything is made up, right? Like what is cheap? There's no gold backing that currency. There's no actual scarce resource backing that currency, right? So I don't understand why we just find it critical to have this underlying core thing that is an orientation towards scarcity. When we're in a digital age, we can create as much of this shit as we want, right? Like it's all made up. It only exists in our heads because we say that it exists, right? And so I am puzzled as to why we continue with a really extractive mindset when we could be shifting towards generative. There's nothing stopping us except ourselves, right, from shifting to something that's more generative.
You'd have to define a purpose for society if you were going to do that sort of thing. I mean, you're missing. Surely that's missing at this moment in time.
A purpose is missing, or a purpose post transition.
Well, I mean, I'll push and counter and say, what is the purpose of the US beyond a slogan?
I don't know that there is, right? Like, again, nation states are something that kind of were a thing only because we needed to extract, right? And a nation state becomes this good mechanism for extraction and for growing the amount of things that we can possibly extract. So perhaps it's just kind of run its course. I don't know. I mean, and then Simon, you of all people, right? You should know that we now have competitors for nation states. Like Facebook is framing itself basically as like a global government. So
it's creating courts and its own currency. Oh, yeah. It hasn't quite got to having an anthem yet, but I'm sure that is coming. Now we've got some other questions as well. So this Farrah, this is one from Mario. Being a serverless hero, when you saw Simon's talk and references to serverless versus Kubernetes, what were some use cases you thought about or insights you got from that? Oh, you're on mute, by the way.
The insights that I got from that I was in the right job and that I was working at the right startup. That's what I got from that. Yeah. And that's the only thing I heard, because again, I had just started at Stackery. I was just a month in and I'd come from a director of operations role, and now, we're now going to cloud-based. And so then there's still servers and serverless. So I mean, I had lots to learn, but what I learned from Simon is that I was in the right I was in the right job in the right market. So that's the insights.
Do you still agree though, 2 years later?
Yes, hands
Perfect.
down.
Hands down. Wonderful.
Hands down.
So I've also got another question coming in from Manish. Principles seem very similar to common sense. What was your reaction from your audience team or when you articulated these simple but principles which remain in textbooks in a corporate-like environment? I don't get the last bit, but what was the reaction when you said you said we should focus on user needs, understand the situation, things like that?
It was at my cohort, like with Ben and.
Oh no, in your organization.
Oh, yeah. In my organization, trying to get them to, I do this with friends. I'm not able to, I haven't been able to get that all the way into my office, but this is something that I do with friends.
Oh, this is an interesting one from Luke Phillips. If it's all money, how do we price in externalities in lieu of ingrained integrity, attacks instead? So that's a really interesting idea. And that is basically, given the fact that it's so cheap to manipulate people and perception, maybe the solution is we just have to raise the cost of manipulation. So we'll have a truth tax. So every time you tell a lie, it's not just like a swear box, a big box for big chunky amounts of money. So every time you lie, another billion has to be dropped in or something. What do you think?
Hey, I'll take it. I mean, I don't know if that's the best way to go, and I don't know that people will pay. And I think people will figure out ways around it. But I think, hey, just maybe do the right thing.
So before we move on, are there, Kat, Ben, any other questions you'd like to raise?
Just one thing that, in response to the last question, and Farrah, what you were saying, and like, man, wouldn't it be wild if integrity mattered, if principles mattered in government and in business and things like that? And just, I have to wonder, like, how far away are principles from power? Like that they're so disconnected that they don't matter, like norms versus power. So that was just like another thing that came to mind around that. And wow, I think we have a lot of work to do around understanding that.
I definitely agree. One of the things that I guess I've tried to figure out is you see startups where, these teams are working really closely together, and there's like this, goal, like, and everybody's on the same mission. And then I don't know I don't know where the breakdown happens, but then something does at some point, and then it becomes about me instead of, we. And I'm still working to get to a company to figure out where that breakdown happens. But yes, I think we'd be a lot better off if more people could, apply those same principles in the business that they're doing every single day.
Kat, any final comments you want to add?
No, I don't think so. Thank you.
Okay, good. Right. So, Farrah, thank you very much. Who's up next? I think it's Kat, isn't it? Kat, are you next?
I am.
So
Yep.
I'm going to throw the ball over to Kat.
Right. Okay. I assume you can see my screen at this point. Yes?
Perfect. Yes.
Okay. So I love my triad, because when Farrah said, oh, what about this idea about principles and a moral compass? All of us said, yes, that's totally great. We read the blog post. It was fantastic. And then I said, I think we should take the audience on a roller coaster ride. And so you had like a really positive, pepped up start with Farrah laying the groundwork, and now you're going to get extremely not that. So the title of my talk is Principles Don't Matter. I guess we'll just jump right in. Okay. There we go. All right, so you're trying to find your way. Oh my goodness. I gotta find my way. Where am I headed? What are you going to need? You're gonna need a compass. How the heck are you gonna find your way if you don't have a compass? Am I right? You gotta have something. Compass, very, very useful. Until you have like the rapid reversal of the poles, right? Like suddenly magnetic north is a completely different place than it was before. And then what good is your compass? It will only serve to confuse you, right? And point you in these strange ways. And I think that's what's happening to us right now. So I believe that we are in this period of rapid acceleration and kind of unprecedented acceleration. And I believe, and there's a body of research around this, that it is not just a technical acceleration, not just a social acceleration, but kind of where the social and the personal intersect in our principles, that the shift of principles is also accelerating in just an incredible way, making it very difficult for us to find our way when we're constantly reorienting around a different true north. And there's this great book here, Social Acceleration. You can read it on your own time. It's very long. Anyway, but we used to see that changes in kind of those natural laws and widely accepted principles and kind of just these things that we consider to be absolutely true, right? You should be trustworthy. You should be this. Those things used to take multiple generations to shift in a significant way. So at least 3 generations is what we saw through recorded human history. And now we are seeing shifts in those principles within single generations, right? And so now we have this, what feels like, really polarized views, because we have the rapid acceleration of the evolution of principles. And so even within a single generation, and certainly across generations, we have wildly different ideas about what those core things are, those truths, those natural laws. And I'll give you a happy example before I give you a very sad example. There's, I think Ben and I have both read a book about same-sex marriage. Yes, that was something that we didn't accept commonly. And then there was pretty rapid shift to that being kind of the law of the land, right? And now that's much more accepted. So we see this rapid evolution, the acceptance of that, and the value or whatever, love is love, and all of those things. It's just shifting very rapidly. I'll give you another example that is perhaps not as awesome, right? Like the idea of race is very new actually to humanity. There was not actually an idea of race going back very far. So we invent this idea of race so that we have some framework for knowing who we should be able to extract from and who we shouldn't. We rapidly evolve that, and now people accept race as science, right? Like race is just a thing. It is true. It exists. It's a fact of our world. But go back, talking hundreds of years, not thousands of years, hundreds of years, and there is not this concept, right? So now we take it for granted in our view of the world. We create systems based on this idea that is a relatively new truth. It's not a consistent thing that we have had throughout humanity. It is not. But now we have systems that are built upon that being a widely accepted truth. And so we are seeing these shifts, and then it's just like anything else that we map, right? When we see the evolution of a thing, it enables all of this higher order, I don't even want to call it innovation in this scenario, crap, can we call it crap, higher order crap, to happen, to spring up, right? So we are rapidly moving things into building block territory, and then we're building on top of them. So what this leads to is a lot of WTF moments, yes, where we see things, and I hear myself say this, I hear other people say this, right? You hear something and you react to it and you say, that's unbelievable, right? How can that happen in this day and age? If you're having one of these WTF moments, that should be a good indication for you that there are building blocks that you are currently taking for granted, and you can't mash it all up in your mind. So what do we do when we can't mash up all of these things in our mind? Hey, create a map, right? So we can map these things, and you don't have to know what it is that you're missing that's causing you to have the WTF moment, right? You only have to know that there is something missing, because then you can map all of the things around that hole, that empty space, and all of those things will give you clues about what is in that empty space that you can't articulate at this time, right? So we have this rapid acceleration. We have more and more WTF moments, and do we think that's going to decrease at all? At what point do we just kind of stabilize and everything's good now? We've adapted. My friends, that is not happening. Things I think are actually going to get even faster, not any slower. We're not like nearing a plateau where now we can all just kind of calm down and cool our jets a little bit. That's not happening. We have gotten to a point, right, where we are able to construct relationships in digital place. So our relationships are no longer tied to a physical place, right? And this has a lot to do with how we can move data around in real time so that we can support forming relationships and maintaining relationships, which are a separate thing, not just an aggregate of transactions, they're a separate thing. We now have the technical capability to support, construct and support and maintain those relationships separated from physical space, which is very cool. That's what we're doing right here, folks, right? None of us are in the same physical space, but we're here, we're hanging out, we're gonna have some cool discussions now and in the future. We're all buds, high five, yeah. But this also has some strange things that happen, right? Farrah alluded to some of those things in her opening talk. In the absence of place as physical place as a constraint, now any weirdo with any idea can go find his people, right? It used to be that you lived in your town or you lived in your community and you had one person who was espousing these beliefs that were just either so out there or not at all helpful for your community or whatever the case may be. And the folks who are in close physical proximity in that community, in the physical place, would say, but we're not doing that, right? But now that weirdo can go online and find friends that will reinforce those views. And we humans, lovely creatures, right? We also talked a little bit about this. There is this behavior, the one-upping or the didding or the whatever you want to call it, right? Where one person says something or shares something, and then the next person has to like one up that, right? I gotta get a little spicier. I'm known for spicy takes. I know all about this, right? But now, is it totally necessary for that one-upping to either start or end with a human? I don't know. It seems like bots have been really good at this, right? Where we start to hear hints of a narrative, and then we can throw some bots at it to like one up that narrative, and then the humans come back and they one up the one upped narrative, right? And so we end up with this cycle where things, that's throwing fuel on the flames of acceleration around some of these values, right? And we've seen that certainly in the US and in North America, like incels, 5 years ago, people were like, what's an incel, right? Or QAnon or any of those things, but we have that non-human actors that are accelerating that. So, boy, that's fun, isn't it? But surely we will find a way to counteract that, right? Like we'll just sit down with these young people and be like, oh, come on, you got a good head on your shoulders, just say no to bots, right? Or we'll like teach them how to identify this. No, my friends, unfortunately, that is not what happens in the world, right? We actually, once those concepts become more evolved, we build things to indoctrinate the next generation and to evaluate the next generation based on those things that we have evolved and now take for granted. And I will give you an example that is inspired by Farrah, who is always keeping us on our toes, okay? So I had here highlighted choice. Let's look at that. Is anyone familiar with this, the Kohlberg model of moral development? Many of us in the West would have been evaluated based on this at some point in our lives. Are you progressing properly as a moral being in society, right? And it basically goes from I don't want to get punished to I have these things inside of me and I don't care about laws and I don't care about rules. I just have to stay true to myself, right? And it kind of progresses through that, right? You'll notice what is missing there is any element of the group or the collective or the community, right? Which is, just like Simon said, something that we tend to shy away from in the West. There is an alternative to the Kohlberg theory of moral development. There is the Gilligan theory of moral development. And in this theory, we go from a place of selfishness where I only care for myself, I'm just trying to survive. Then we go to the opposite extreme. We care for others at our own expense in certain cases. And then we go through this really difficult transitional space where we have to hold contradictions between what's good for me and what's good for my community. And then, just as Farrah described, if we transcend to this highest stage, then we're able to make our world big enough where we can hold the contradiction between what's good for me and what's good for my community in our heads and make sense of that. We can integrate that. And that's what I think true integrity is, right? Where you're living true to yourself in a way that acknowledges that you're part of a community, of a bigger thing. So if we are constantly being evaluated based on an ethic of choice, what is that doing to us, right? If it's constantly reinforced that you just have to make good choices, what does that mean? That if you're not getting things, if you don't have money, if you don't have prestige, it's because you made bad choices, right? And that's an incredibly dangerous thing for us to believe at this time. That is not the thing we should believe when we are constructing a truly global society. So when we sense things like this, right, that just don't make sense, it does not make sense that your choices, it's just your choices that determine everything about your life. That WTF moment is a good opportunity, a good signal for you that you need to create a moment of disfluency. And how do we do that? How do we make those building blocks conspicuous enough where we can talk about them and describe them and ask, just like Farrah said, if they're good for us, right? If we are acting with integrity when we are building upon those building blocks, right? The way that we can create that disfluency is through maps. So we can take a moment to make things conspicuous. So instead of just swinging the hammer to hit a nail, we can look at the hammer and be like, oh my goodness, is this the right tool for the job? Is this a good hammer for me personally, right? So mapping is this way that we can take time to create a moment of disfluency, and we can question the things that we take for granted. So I won't, I'm intentionally trying to be a total turd right now, right? So that we have some spicy discussion. But it's not that principles don't matter, it's that principles in action matter. Not our espoused principles, right? Oh, truth is so important, but yet we have someone in the US leading us right now who lies, hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of times every week. Truth doesn't actually matter when we're putting our principles into action, right? So principles in action matter. Integrity, as in our ability to integrate our personal stances in a social setting, that matters. Being true to ourselves and being able to espouse and act in ways that are coherent, that matters. And my friends, you can, and you already are organizing your way to a future. The things that you do today are opening and closing options for the future. So if you are already doing that, then the question is not, can you organize your way to a future? Can't you organize your way to a future? It is, which future are you currently organizing towards? And that's it. That's my rant.
Wow. Fabulous stuff. Really, really good. I mean, obviously, I do a lot of mapping of ethical values, and they evolve, and so I love a lot of what I'm hearing. And there is an issue, is that the process of evolution, doesn't matter whether of any form of capital, data, practices, knowledge, even values, accelerates as mechanisms of communication industrialized. So that's why it all speeded up after the printing press, the postage stamp, the telephone, the internet. And unfortunately, it's reached a point that change is now so rapid, it's occurring several times within our lifetime. So it took 1,000 years for nuts and bolts, or 2,000 years for nuts and bolts to become a commodity. It took, what was it, 100 and something or other. Oh no, it was much longer than that. It was about 1,400 for electricity. And then, we're at the point where it takes like 30 to 50 now. And so these massive changes, the practices that come from it, the changes of society, we have very little time now to adjust. First of all, I love the Twitter legend of "just say no to bots." I mean, that is such a line. Truly fantastic stuff. And we've got a question here from Cliff Hazel. What principles do you think matter to the current government leadership? Seems like they're different rather than non-existent. So what do you think are the principles that we're operating to?
Yeah, I mean, I think like the foundational logic there is one of choice. And if choice is your most critical belief, then we get things like the just world fallacy and all of that, right? Because things are fair. Everyone makes their own choices. And so things are fair. So I think choice for us in the West, especially, is critical. That's core, right? And then going along with that is that we value, or certainly the folks who are in positions to perpetuate or disrupt existing power paradigms. A lot of alliteration there. You like that? Okay. They hold choice and then extraction as a core belief. So earlier in the chat, someone said, "Isn't power scarce?" Well, yes, power over, which is inherently extractive, that is scarce, right? There's only so many people, there's only, but power to, which is a generative take on power, that is not scarce, right? Because we have this nearly boundless human potential. So power to is not scarce. So I think that's certainly in the West, the two things that our leaders generally tend to like is choice and then extraction.
Well, that's very much because this gets to the heart of this whole me versus we, because we're all elements, the me versus we debate, because we're all elements of me and we. It's a question of balance between them. So if you look at more the sort of Confucian sort of origins, there's much greater balance towards the we, which is talking about your ethic of care. Whereas the individualism, the sort of Socrates philosophy, is much more about the ethics of choice, the individual rights, the individual liberties. That's a fascinating one. Ben, Farrah, do you want to make any comments on this?
I'm just very suddenly, in a way, I think awakened by the things that I've heard, and suddenly very angry about the direction that a lot of people are receiving right now, both implicitly and explicitly, to take individual responsibility. I think common narratives in the UK and in the US is like, we trust you individually to do what's best without providing any framing or context. And the result is basically self-interest and perhaps chaos. And that is very frustrating to me at this particular moment. So good job, Kat.
It's not just self-interest, right? It's that also that sense of immediacy. And that's the thing that I also like to talk about, that some of you will have already heard me rant about, is that our concept of the present is just shrinking, right? So what's best for me is really different if I'm talking about the next 5 minutes or if I'm talking about the next 5 years, right? And so that sense of immediacy combined with your individual responsibility to act in your best interest, right? There's inherently some contradiction there. And then I, for one, don't love it.
The whole focus on the me, and also the focus on short-termism as well.
Yeah.
Immediate impact. Okay. Farrah, any comments from you, Farrah, on what you've heard?
No, I mean, I feel the exact same way. I mean, again, it's, I don't like it either. I will say that.
Okay, so let's have a look at some of the questions. So Ben has asked, how do you balance different groups of we a person might belong to? So, for example, we're all members of many collectives. So your nation, your church, if you're a member of a church, football club, if you're a member of a football club, your family, or whatever it happens to be, they're all collectives. And we have this, each of them have different values and different beliefs, and we're a combination of all of this. So how do you balance different groups of we a person might belong to? And might that create, multiple conflicting paradoxes within a single person?
Yes. Firstly, I want to make sure, because this question tells me that we constructed this session in a way that makes sense, because I feel like it's foreshadowing for Ben's talk coming up here in a few moments. But yes, I think in my experience, if the bigger you make your world, right, eventually it's so big that you all have something in common, right? All of those individual collectives are part of one collective, right? And so then you can shrink back in and say, oh, okay, I've now encountered the first place going from common to not common, where we encounter things that are at odds, right? And for me, it's very helpful to go from that place of commonality to the place of difference rather than the place of difference out to commonality, right? But yeah, of course, that creates contradiction, and that's integrity, right? That we can be fully ourselves and action our beliefs coherently in a space where we belong to multiple things, right? And having the brain power, the emotional power, the moral power to hold the contradiction in your head is not easy at all, right? Think of, I'm sure each and every one of us know someone who does this, and we at certain points in our lives have been the person that does this, right? Where you espouse a belief, right? But then when that belief would come into contradiction with either an action that you've taken or an opportunity that you have available to you, or whatever the case may be, our brains will do amazing things to avoid holding that contradiction in our heads, right? So I think just being able to be conscious of that contradiction is not pleasant. However, it is such a wonderful place to be, right? That you have made it to a point where you can be conscious of the contradiction. So when I have that feeling, I'm freaked out, but I'm also very thankful, if that makes any sense.
No, it does. I mean, we've got three things there. We've got principles in terms of almost ways of operating, actions that we take, some of which are universally useful. We've got values, so the things we believe in. And there are 7 known shared values. Oliver S. Curry's work, so things like respect for family, respect for law. So there are these sort of 7 core, and probably the best place for that is actually the United Nations. Represents a sort of common shared values. And then, of course, we've got behaviors themselves. So, here's what I value as in belief, not principles, because they're just universally useful ways of operating, which are true to everyone. But here are the values, some of which are common, some of which are specific to my collective, and here is my action. So I believe in, for example, fairness to everybody, and then I go and, I don't know, get an eye test at some castle because if one rule applies to everyone else and one rule applies to me. Behavior and values don't necessarily chime, but that's an issue. And at the heart of this all is this whole question of me and we as well. But you mentioned Ben, and I can see the time. We may as well pick up the ball. And Ben, we're going to throw it in your direction.
All right. I'm so grateful to have the chance to be along for the ride with Farrah and Kat. They're tough acts to follow, but I will do my best. So I'm going to share my screen here and start my talk which I think I've decided to title, all good titles are done at the last minute. I think I've decided to title this that it's Principles versus Landscape. And it's not about choice as a subtitle. So with that, we're going to cover, I think, 3 rough areas over the course of this talk. I think we're going to start with a little bit about conditions and consequences as a frame for thinking. And then we'll talk about maps and power and conclude with a discussion of paradox and choice. So with that, I'd like to start with an invitation, and I do a lot of facilitation, and so one of the things I like to create is opportunities for participation. And while I can't be as interactive with you all as I would like to be normally, something that you could do as you go along this talk is you could have a piece of paper and you could take notes and think about some of the questions that are coming up for you, and just notice along the way where the contradiction occurs, and where, as Kat mentioned, the WTF moments, that maybe something requires, further inspection. Okay, so the first thing is an invitation to ask yourself, what do you want? I think when we talk about strategy and we talk about decision making, a lot of the times it gets conflated with just making decisions towards some goal, and the fact that you are there to achieve something and that you're trying to figure out how to achieve that thing. I think it's important to have a notion of what it is that you want. And so think about that for a moment. You want things, whether they are you personally or you in an organizational context, you want things. And the next prompt I would have for you is consider this frame of that situation. If I just blank, then that thing I want will happen. And maybe this is kind of the beginnings of a plan. If I just do this thing, then maybe it will happen, right? And this is an example of something that we call means and ends thinking. This is a concept from Deciphering Sun Tzu by Derek M.C. Yuan. And I think it is focused on interventionism, plan making, creating chains of causally linked ideas that if we just create the perfect plan, if we just describe how if X then Y in enough ways, then eventually we will come to the point where we have the result that we were looking for. We have planned our way into success. We've achieved the goal. And of course, the trouble with interventionism is that things don't always go according to plan, mostly because reality is messier than we can ever precisely think of it as being. And not only that, but every time we intervene in a system, we create new unintended consequences. And that is a challenge, something about which I cannot explore today deeply. Another way of looking at this might be if we consider for a moment not the plan for achieving our goal, but the factors that will determine whether or not we are able to achieve that goal. So as you're thinking about that goal, what are the factors that are going to play into whether or not you will reach the consequence that you were hoping for, or something like that consequence, an adjacent possibility that might also be just fine, all things considered. And I expect this to be something more of a big list of potential things that are playing into the situation. I'm giving a talk right now that if I wanted to really compress this down to this moment, my goal was to give the talk. And one way of doing that would be to come up with all the precise things I needed to do and in which order I needed to say the words and all the precise things I needed to do to make sure that you were able to take away what I wanted you to take away. But that's really exhausting. And so what I am thinking about instead are the conditions. Can I have a few good points? Can I pay attention to what people say in chat? Can I integrate things that Kat and Farrah have said into the talk to make a precise point? There are so many specific things, lighting, timing, all this kind of stuff. These are factoring into it, but there's no precise plan to navigate all those. And so that's what we call conditions and consequences. If we pay attention to conditions, what we can do is over a longer period of time, cultivate the consequences that we want by implication, not by planning, by implication. If the conditions are accounted for, then the consequences become inevitable. So I want to talk now about maps and power. What I just did was provided a bit of a common frame for how I'm thinking about questions of power, how I'm thinking about mapping as a thing. And so I hope it helps connect some of the weirder jumps I'm going to make in a moment. I'm going to assert that maps as models of reality are models of relational dispositions of power. They're the conditions, how power occurs in capitalism. So if that's true, then to make maps is to create access to that power by creating knowledge. So together we are mapping, we are creating knowledge together, knowledge that might already exist actually, but we're creating access to that knowledge together, and by doing so, creating access to that power. And so in a means ends frame, in a planning frame, we underestimate the complexity of those dispositions of power. They're massively complex. We cannot account for every reality. And so the interaction may often not be plannable. There is no one answer to things. When we think about the way the power system will play out, we cannot actually predict fully the way that it will occur. And so what I would argue for is to pay attention to conditions. Can we pay attention to the conditions in play by making maps, by creating access to the power that is occurring around us already, as opposed to planning things out and trying to create a perfect outcome based on if X, then Y kind of steps? So can we cultivate conditions instead? And so this brings me to paradox. Paradox in deciphering Sun Tzu and in general in the art of war and so on is an important concept to understand. And what I'd like to do is sort of introduce the opportunity for us to view the choice or the framing of choice as one between landscape and doctrine. So landscape being the contextual awareness, landscape being the way that we pay attention to conditions, and doctrine, of course, being the universal principles that we choose to apply in all contexts. Instead of this being a choice, I'd like to create the opportunity for us to view it as a paradox. So choice, maybe not. Paradox, perhaps. In this sort of way of framing the world, if we think about paradoxes, oftentimes we like to think of opposites. So vacuity versus substance. So the absence of things versus the things, right? The direct approaches versus the indirect approaches. The orthodox versus the unorthodox, as if these are choices, right? Like we are either going to be orthodox or we're going to be unorthodox, right? And one of the things I like to say is that my approach to Wardley mapping is unorthodox as a way to frame myself as not being Simon Wardley, which is great. However, the way that I teach mapping often sneaks in these little orthodox aspects, right? So thinking about these not as choices, but as interplays. So actually, if we think about it this way, each of these opposite pairs leads to the other. If we take direct approaches, then indirect approaches may become most appropriate. If we take indirect approaches, then direct approaches may present themselves. And so thinking of this not as one or the other, and that's the decision we've made, but as a constantly modulated and interacting kind of back and forth, then we can start to open ourselves up to holding the contradiction, as Kat was describing earlier, in our head, and allowing ourselves to value one thing and value another and find how they interact in order to make more meaningful decisions as we go forward. So I think doctrine and landscape, so doctrine being universalities, always do X, and landscape being contextualities, this is the specific thing, here's the disposition of power, here are the conditions, and we just need to flow through these in this precise way. I think these are two things that we need to hold in our head at the same time and in a perhaps contradictory fashion in order to fully appreciate how it all, the true number of possibilities that are there as a result. So this requires me to describe a little bit about extension and return, because it's not that simple. I mean, this is maybe a step forward, appreciating both at the same time, both dimensions, but it's actually not that simple. It's even maybe perhaps twice as complex as that. Overextension of one dimension of these pairs always leads to return. So if I double down on making maps, then inevitably I will run into a brick wall that will force me to integrate the opposite of that, the doctrinal universalities, and vice versa. If I focus my entire work on being orthodox, eventually that will fail because I need unorthodox methods in order to adapt and change. So thinking about how overextension in one dimension leads to return, what I want to call our attention to is the qualities of each of these dimensions, so landscape versus doctrine. And I want to talk about the overextension of each of these in order to better appreciate how this can play out. So I would say that the quality of our attention to the landscape, paying attention to the conditions, can lead to fluidity of action. If I know inherently what the disposition of power is in any one situation, then action becomes natural. I don't have to overanalyze. I don't have to sit there and wonder which option is good. And like most organizations, right, I'm not flying without an understanding of what's happening around me. I can flow into the situation as it plays out and at the moment it plays out, as opposed to planning my way through it. But overextension of an appreciation of the landscape can lead to two things, right? It can lead to exhaustion. Not all of us are super psyched by doing analysis and considering all the potential possibilities. Like there's a very anxious way of going about doing landscape-based appreciation of things that, it can be overwhelming. You could literally just burn yourself out by trying to calculate all the possibilities. And the second thing that it could lead to is moral disconnect. So being so disconnected from the consequences of your immediacy of action, yes, the power disposition is this way and I can flow into that and seize the advantage. Oh crap, that had consequences, right? So missing that bigger picture because you were unconstrained in that action. And so similarly, I think we can look at principles in this way. So a quality of having principles leads to restraint. I not only do I have to not consider every immediate possibility, I can close out a ton of them. I can stop considering options that compromise integrity. I can stop considering options that compromise kindness. I can actually remove that choice for myself and restrain my actions to a specific field of those options. And it also leads me to restraint in terms of morality and choices of what I value and how I choose to live my life. Being principled means something here, right? But overextension of principles also leads to a dual threat. It leads to vulnerability through predictability. If you are so constrained by principles that must apply in all cases, that makes you predictable. And it also means that you're going to make bad decisions that compromise what was contextually appropriate. Not to step into a giant hornet's nest here, but let's talk about free speech for a second. If we always say that everything is free speech and just argue about that from a doctrinal standpoint, we're going to run into trouble because we haven't defined what is or is not free speech in that moment. There is an overplay of that hand. I hope you're going to at me on Twitter and say I said terrible things now, because we could have a good discussion then. But it also leads to an inability to adapt. Like if you were literally only able to take actions that are inside the option space of your principles, then in a context where maybe freedom of speech wasn't the right thing to prioritize in that moment, right? Then you will be constrained and you will make bad choices, contextually bad choices that will have consequences. So fluidity constrained by principles, I think, is an interesting option here, a particularly potent combination of being able to fluidly adapt to circumstances by understanding the dispositions of power, but be constrained in your options by principles. And that creates the right kind of contradiction where you can consider a lot of options, but you can also be considering the principles that underlie how you behave and act. So my conclusion, if there is one, is that it's not about choice, it's about interplay. It's not about choosing one, it's not about choosing the other, it's about understanding and modulating the extension and avoidance of overextension of each option so that you create a rich and vibrant option space between those things. I I have 30 seconds left, so I will not do the gratuitous diversion, but I want to thank you for listening to my rantings.
Oh, do the gratuitous diversion. We can't miss that.
Are you sure?
Oh, yes.
Okay. So if maps model relational dispositions of power in capitalism, I'd like to call attention to the question of how actual power is different than perceived power. In deciphering Sunsa, there's this interesting difference between Xie and Xing. And these are like really interesting concepts, and I'm not very good at describing them, or even like, you should just read the book by Derek MC Yuan. But I'd like to say, if we're concerned about discussions about power, let's talk about how discussions about power create access or decrease access to that power, and they can change the asymmetries or decrease them. So we're talking about creating access, for talking about enabling people to change those dispositions and change the way that asymmetry works or doesn't work. After all, this whole kind of field of work is about allowing the weak to overcome the strong by understanding that option space. Then I have some interesting questions about complaints about discussions of power, because I think they implicate a desire for continued asymmetry. So that is something I am curious about. I think we all should be curious about as well.
So can I ask on that, complaints, an example of a complaint about discussions of power?
Well, I think it's interesting that there are a lot of discussions about politics, or rather, don't get political, Simon.
Oh gosh, God, isn't that? Oh, yeah, there's my WTF moment. Thank you, Ben.
Gotta have at least one.
Very good. Yes, yeah, very, very, very true.
If you're not sure, like if you don't want to have discussions about politics, then the question becomes, are you just going to put your head in the sand and pretend like the politics aren't there?
Mm-hmm.
Are you going to just like allow them to happen to you? Like not being aware of them is an abdication of responsibility. I mean, it's really not like individualist frame. It's not taking care of yourself even. But
yeah.
Anyway.
So now this is an interesting, so going back to an earlier point, because one of the things about the doctrine, and I just need to be clear here, in terms of when I talk about values, those are things we believe in. When I talk about principles, those are ways of operating, things we do. And so when I talk about doctrine, those are universally useful ones in terms of companies, like focus on user needs, remove duplication. They're not things you believe in. You can say if we believe in user needs, well, that's a bit pointless because it turns out it's pretty universal. So one of the things about that doctrine is if you just follow the doctrine, it forces you to map anyway, because you start by going about user needs, understand the value chain, understand the context, you're mapping before you know it. But interestingly, all the doctrine comes from maps as well. So it's completely circular. And in fact, there's one piece of doctrine, which is the only piece which hasn't come from it, that process. And it's probably the most relevant, seek the best. And it's to the point where, and I started with there. I thought, okay, I want to find the best universal principles. So I'll start with that as my catalyst, seek the best. And of course, now I've got this wonderful table. I'm looking at seek the best and thinking, well, you helped create the table, but you're the most useless of all of them. So I might throw you out. But there's this wonderful cycle. Well, I find it enjoyable. Maybe I'm going mad. So they're quite limited in numbers, and there's very few I find that are universal. Most of them are context specific. I mean, is that what you mean by don't overextend yourself? Is the application the universal ones, you shouldn't apply them universally? Or is it, hey, there's only a limited number, don't try to make everything universal?
Well, I think the trick with the universality of it is that it's universal to you, Simon.
Oh, like that's because it's mine. Yeah.
Those principles, I think, are far more fluid in each context than you might think. And actually, like, there's an interesting discussion, I think, like, principles, great. Like start from there. Like I don't really teach people to map right away anymore. Like I tell them to make lists, like make lists of users, make lists of needs, like understand all that stuff. And that seems like universally useful in the context of capitalism, at least in the United States for me, in the context of being in the Earth planet. Like, I don't know, like beyond that, I don't know, right? But between groups of people, like there's this notion of like having to come to agreement about what is common sense or what is universal. Yep. And it's that agreement part that gets really messy. And you can be highly principled and do very bad things is the edge of that, I think, about overextension. So that's something I just point out a little bit.
No, perfectly true. But there's another interesting side to this, is that, of course, if I take one of those doctrines, like focus on user needs, I mean, I say that's universal. It's a good idea to think about user needs. But of course, the application of that is always context specific. Your user needs may not be the same as my user needs anyway. So we're running around in this wonderful little cycle. And I love that counterbalance of doctrine and landscape. That's a really interesting way of thinking about it.
Wouldn't have happened without the discussions that we had with Kat and Farrah.
I've seen your Slack discussions. I mean, they're fantastic. I mean,
we didn't even get to Cardi B though.
Well, I know we haven't got that far yet.
Another time.
Kat, Farrah, do you have any comments for Ben?
I think Farrah should have to talk because she's always the one reminding us that we are the system, we're acting on the system is acting on us.
Sorry. Yes. My mind is like, I think is like just kind of like looping. I mean, that paradox where you talked about, how they affect each other. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, I'm again, like my mind is spinning. And again, I guess I would ask Ben, like how, when you're doing these, like you're cultivating these conditions, how do I guess like, I wish I could draw on a map with you right now. I'm trying to like, how do I take what I've drawn right here and like put it, get it to in front of you? I actually wonder if I'm in the extension and return phase, kind of, I wonder if I am maybe part of my own system, just because I have come from such a different, the way I used to think, the way I used to act, the way I used to treat people, how I voted, going to church, what was important to me is all very different than what's important to me today. And so I wonder if I'm holding on too strong because I'm afraid that I'm going to lose some of myself in playing this game, and I don't want to. I don't want I don't want this system to, I don't want the system to become me. And I think that's one of the things that I'm most concerned about is, as you start to play this game, how do I take a step back and make sure that this is really where I want to be?
It's a really hard dynamic to manage, and it's even harder to be self-aware of it. And at least for me, like oftentimes self-awareness leads to inaction, which is also not great. But even that is a way that like there's an opposite pair. There's like bias for action, bias for self-awareness, like, in a certain way that's another kind of extension and return that's happening for both of those dimensions. But like, it's hard. It really is hard.
Well, I feel like if you read it, I would have like what the fuck or the W2F moments like almost all day. Sometimes I think I could be doing that. I could be having and trying to map with new information 10 times a day. Surely here in the States and the way things are done, I think we all have those WTF moments. But
yeah, it's interesting because building on, Ben, your comment about overextension of landscape leads to exhaustion. This reminds me of 2006, I think it was, in the British Library, looking at an issue with maps. And my issue I was looking at was, why do we keep on using KPIs? And I remembered Ashby's law of requisite variety. So basically, the controlling system has to have as much complexity as what is being, controlled, the inputs and the outputs of what's being controlled. And so there's two ways of actually solving that problem. If you've got a complex and potentially complicated system, is you either increase the capacity within the controlling element, or you pretend that what's being controlled is simple. And this is the thing I find with, with these management KPIs. It's almost like we've gone, oh, this is just too difficult. So we'll create a fantasy land. Now I've got a couple of levers. I'm a train driver again. And there's a little bit, I've had some pushback in terms of mapping. People go, oh, we can't do that. It's too difficult. Well, you mean you don't want to look at, oh, you don't want to expose. No, I just want a lever, that's all. Did you find elements of that when you were exploring this space? Mr. Ben.
I guess I question the framing of it in a way, because like it can be true that you've got folks coming into the situation making decisions by feeling, right? And like feeling is great because it's rapid. Like you can make intuitive decisions very quickly and you don't have to expend resources to consider all the possibilities. The trick, I think, is that Wardley mapping in some ways can bias towards analysis in ways that a lot of people are not comfortable doing. And what's worse is like it's not just that it's an either or again. I don't know, that seems to be a theme of everything these days. It's not just an either or. There's a transition space in the middle that I think is under mapped, underexplored. It's like, how do you help people take the incremental from 0 couch to 5K version of getting the mapping? And it's not step 0, make a map. Like it just doesn't work that way for people. They're like, I'm going to do a bunch of work and what am I going to get for it? I don't even believe your premise. You can say know the details all you want, but like that sounds hard and it sounds like you just like your framework, right? So that would be the challenge I would present to that.
No, I absolutely understand. So Kate's asked a wonderful question here. Can anyone on the panel identify any modern postmodern principle making organization that people might be listening to? So can anybody think of any principle-led organization that people might be using as an example? Sorry, that's AWS's second ever book, Reaching Cloud Velocity. Not that I'm trying to hint that would be example, especially not since they've got about 20 pages of maps explaining how they actually play the game and all the rest of it as well. So to answer Kate's question, anybody identify a yes?
Doesn't Netflix? I think Netflix uses it as well.
Yeah, Netflix I think is the truly exceptional. I think Amazon is good, but I think Netflix personally is even slightly better, which is why I think they can actually survive happily and compete with on AWS and compete with AWS as well. I think they've got a slight edge. This has been fantastic. I love talking with you all. Before we go, because we've run out of time, because I blah, blah, blah too much, is there one message you would like to leave everybody? Should we go back in order? Farrah, one message.
One message. I would say, that to pay attention to those WTF moments.
Kat?
I guess my one message is that everything these days is imaginary and it only exists because we buy into it and we allow our mental space to be constrained by the things that already exist. And so you have the option to opt out or opt for something new or different or better. And I hope that you feel and appreciate that power.
Ben?
Oh man. I think this is going to feel a little disjoint to everything else, but maybe perhaps it's relevant to the last thing we discussed, which is if you are here and you have not made a Wardley map before, allow yourself to not feel the guilt of doing that, of not having done that, and instead start with some of the early Doctrine things and make lists. And you will get very far just by starting there.
On that note, I'm going to say thank you. It was wonderful. Really, I mean, that hour and a half has just flown by. So thank you all for coming along and speaking. Really, really enjoyed it. Take care and look after yourselves. And thank you also to the audience for coming and listening. All of this stuff will be on YouTube. And I think in half an hour, Kat, you and me are on an armchair with Dave Snowden, and so this is going to be interesting. Anyway, thank you so much, and at that point, I'll say goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.